I wanted to comment on today's first reading from the book of Numbers. Notice the people are complaining because they're tired of the manna. So the manna was this miraculous stuff that appeared on the ground every morning. People would collect it, and it was able to sustain them. So it was miraculous bread from heaven or created by God simply to sustain the people. So it's something that they should have appreciated, and to a certain extent they did, at least for a while. They got tired of it and they started complaining. And we might easily blame them, but we can see where they're coming from, because if you're eating the same thing for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every single day for a long period of time, you're going to get tired of that. You're going to want something different. So the fact that they complain, well, it's kind of understandable, and we tend to do the same. There's a saying that familiarity breeds contempt. Familiarity breeds contempt. The people became too familiar with the manna. It was too common. It was happening every day. They were eating it every day. It led to contempt, a lack of appreciation for it. And like I said, it's easy to understand how that could happen, because we tend to be the same. And we ought to learn an important lesson from this, is that we can easily take the Eucharist for granted. We become too familiar with the Eucharist, and we don't realize what a tremendous gift the Eucharist is. Now, when we consider the manna or even the multiplication of the loaves, which we have in today's gospel reading, they're really a foreshadowing of the Eucharist. So how much do we really appreciate the Eucharist? How much do we really understand the Eucharist? Now notice that Moses, so the people are complaining to Moses, and then Moses is complaining to God, and basically he's saying, Lord, why did you put me in charge of all these people? Where am I going to get enough meat to feed all of them? You put this heavy burden upon me to have to take care of all these people. So Moses is complaining. But you see what's behind his complaint. It's not just that he's overwhelmed with the situation that he's in. He actually is manifesting genuine concern for the people. He actually wants to provide meat for all of them. He actually wants them to be appeased so that they will stop complaining. He's got genuine concern for them. And that's actually a good thing. And in fact, we see the same in today's gospel reading. The apostles come to our Lord, or the disciples come and tell our Lord, look, this is a deserted place, the hour is late, send the crowds away so that they can buy food for themselves. They're concerned about them, and that's a good thing. And in fact, we see the same from our Lord. He had compassion on the crowds, and so he heals their sick. So God has concern for us. The disciples had concern for the people. Moses had concern for the Israelites. Very good. And we ought to have concern for our fellow men. Some people say, oh, well, am I my brother's keeper? And the answer is yes, you are. Because anything and everything that you do or fail to do is somehow going to impact the people around you, the people you interact with, even if it's a complete stranger. So what we do, what we say, all these things have an impact. And yes, we are our brother's keeper. We should have concern for them. Now, today is the feast of St. Jean-Marie Vianney. And as you know, he's an extremely great saint. In fact, he is the patron saint of parish priests. And hopefully you know that he had a lot of struggles in regards to getting his education to be able to qualify for ordination, to be ordained as a priest. So growing up, he didn't have any education. So he actually started his studies when he was 18 years old. And he had a hard time with them. He had a hard time especially learning Latin. And everything had to be in Latin. The questions were in Latin. Your answers had to be in Latin. And if you're not good with languages, some people are just not good with languages. They might be very intelligent in many areas, but they're just not good with languages. And I think he was like that. So he struggled, but he was kicked out of the seminary, but one of his pastors took compassion on him and privately tutored him, and he was able eventually to pass his exams and to be ordained, but they didn't think he would amount to much as a priest, so they put him into this very small parish of ours with 230 people, which is not very large. And of course, not all those people are going to go to Mass. It was just the old ladies who would go to Mass. So here he is, in this parish, and he realizes that the people in his town are committing all kinds of sins. And they've become so commonplace that people don't think it's sin anymore. So, for example, working on the Sabbath day, working on Sundays, or just, immodest dancing and things like that, or taking God's name in vain. And so he wanted to convert the town, but, how did he go about this? And what's interesting is that he gave himself over to a very intense routine of prayer and penance. So he hardly ate anything. And he denied himself of sleep also. He would spend all of his spare time in prayer. So eventually his holiness started to have an impact and people were drawn to him. He wasn't a very good speaker. Initially he had a very hard time preaching. And then his homilies started to get longer and longer. And, somebody was asked, does he have long sermons? And yes, he does. But he believes in hell. And this statement from someone, it's an actual quotation, is interesting because it's almost like many priests don't preach on the reality of hell. So they're kind of taking note. He believes in hell. In other words, he's preaching about the reality of hell, which is a good thing. But you see, one thing in the life of St. John Marie Vianney, why was he undertaking all these penances and spending so much time in prayer? Part of the reason was because of his humility. He knew that by himself, with his own powers, with his own intellect, with his own capabilities, he couldn't convert anyone. He understood this. So he understood that it's only by the grace of God that he could do this. And he actually prayed regularly, Lord, help me to save souls. Help me to guide souls to heaven. So he also manifested this genuine concern for the well-being of the people under his care. Now, this is the theme that I was trying to reiterate. Moses is concerned about the Israelites. The disciples are concerned about the 5,000 people that are with our Lord. We also need to be concerned about others. Now, granted, you may not be priests or disciples, or you don't have the position of Moses. Understood. But nevertheless, our tendency is just to be wrapped up in ourselves, in our own world, to be doing our own things and thinking about our own needs. And the whole point is we need to think about others. And recall the message of Our Lady of Fatima. Many go to hell simply because there's no one to pray for them. If we're not even aware of the needs of our neighbor, we're not going to be inclined to want to pray for them. Somebody pointed out, Bishop Joseph Strickland, he said, he's encouraging people to petition the Pope to set aside a particular day where we will all fast for an end to what's happening in Gaza. In other words, he's so concerned, he wants us to fast. And I think that's a wonderful idea. Now, whether the Pope will do this or not, I don't know. But how many people are praying for the situation there, right? So when we see people in need, we ought to be motivated to want to do something about it. Sometimes we can help financially by giving donations. But how about the spiritual need? The spiritual need of people is even harder to detect and to recognize. But the reality is that people are going to hell. They're on the path to hell because they rejected belief in God. They've adopted a sinful lifestyle, which is common in today's world. And we just seem to be okay with it. In other words, we're not doing much about it. But if we really had genuine concern, maybe we would do something similar to St. John Marie Vianney, making sacrifices for them, even fasting, but certainly praying for their conversion, praying for them, and ideally looking for opportunities to proclaim the truth to them.